I've always been interested in feats of endurance. There's something about reaching the mental and physical breaking point that has always compelled me. This obsession started when I trained for my first marathon in my early 20s. After that, I progressed to triathlons and finally ultramarathons. I read that some people consider rowing across the Atlantic Ocean as the ultimate endurance challenge. Only a handful of people have ever done it, and most take months to cross. Months of rowing on the open sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest human, and thousands of miles from the nearest land. I knew I'd found my next project. I spent the next few months preparing, training my body, buying an appropriate rowing boat that would protect me, and assembling a team to help me plan. I knew that for me, the biggest problem would be spending non-stop days and nights out on the open ocean. As a part of my training, I decided to plan a practice trip on a shorter route. Instead of crossing the entire ocean, I planned to leave the Great Guana Cay in the Bahamas and row to Bermuda. My team and I figured it'd take me around 10 to 14 days to reach my destination. I loaded up with enough ballast to simulate the supplies I'd need for the full voyage, then set off from the port in the early morning. The first few hours were rough with choppy waters and the sun beating down. Still, I was able to get into a rhythm. I'd long since learned that tiring myself out was not going to be helpful, so I allowed myself to take a rest every few minutes. I sat opposite my direction of travel, so the coastline of the island behind my boat was always in view. The tallest tree on the island dropped below the horizon an hour before noon. The sunset on that first day was spectacular. I paused to eat a snack, admiring the colors in the sky. I also inspected my hands for signs of blisters. I was feeling good, so I picked the oars back up and continued to row. The temperature dropped as the sky began to darken, turning from boiling to balmy. When I checked my GPS a few hours later and saw that I had traveled nearly 25 miles into the open ocean, I decided to call it a night. I tried to sleep but found the rocking of the waves made it all but impossible. Still, I was glad for the experience. I tried to brainstorm some kind of stabilizer to help me sleep as I lay in my cabin. After 3 hours of failing to fall asleep, I gave up and decided to start rowing again. When I had set back into position and dipped my oars into the water, I was delighted to see the ocean give off a bright blue light. I'd read about bioluminescent plankton before, but this was my first time ever actually seeing them in person. I shot a look up at the stars and was blown away. I won't wax poetic, but they were absolutely glorious. I spent the next 20 minutes or so just watching them shimmer as I rowed. It helped that the ocean had calmed down considerably. I only noticed when I looked down during my next break. The ocean hadn't just calmed down, the ocean had gone still. I'm not referring to the doldrums, calm periods that occasionally occur when the wind dies down. No, this wasn't just a lack of wind or waves. There weren't even any ripples on the water. The ocean was a perfectly polished black mirror reflecting the black sky and stars above. The only disturbances I could see for miles around came from the wake caused by my own boat. I looked around for a long moment confused. I'd never seen anything like it before. I dipped my hand in the ocean, then held it up, trying to feel if there was any wind. Nothing. After a minute of confusion, I began to row again, figuring it'd be better to take advantage of the calm water to get some extra distance. I spent the next half hour or so passing through the uneasy stillness, cutting across the polished surface of reflected stars, occasionally lit up by a flash of luminescent plankton. I didn't see the wall of fog until it was almost upon me. Like I said, I sat backwards as I was rowing. I shot a glance over my shoulder in my direction of travel to see a mile-high curtain of fog approaching over the surface of the water. I pulled my oars out of the water, then hastily brought up the weather reports I'd gathered for the expedition, worried that it might be a storm. The reports all said what I'd remembered they'd said. There wasn't even supposed to be rain during this next week. Still, something about that wall of impenetrable fog was unnerving, particularly combined with the flat water. I briefly considered turning my boat around before dismissing the idea. No, my best bet was to weather the storm. In the few minutes I'd taken to consult the weather reports, the fog had already moved noticeably closer. I braced myself as it crept over my boat. I was expecting wind, maybe lightning, certainly more waves. But no, my boat silently entered the wall of fog, illuminated from above by a now hazy crescent moon. I tried to take a picture with my phone, but found that the lighting conditions were far too dark to make anything out. Sleep was off the table. I was far too unnerved for that. That meant there were only two options. I could sit and wait, or I could row. I chose to row. I had to work up the courage to begin again. Something about breaking that silence with my oars seemed almost sacrilegious. A sound came echoing from out in the distance, mixing with the sounds of my oars, cutting through the water. It sounded like a distant banging of metal against metal, like an old, weathered bell. My visibility was only 50 feet or so, but I kept straining to watch for any shapes in the darkness. And then, between bell chimes, came the muffled sound of men shouting. I was immediately concerned that a cargo ship had sailed into the fog with me, though I knew I was far from any shipping lanes. I kept scanning the fog in all directions, praying that whatever was making that sound wouldn't run me over. As I scanned to my right, the reflection of stars in the flat water caught my attention. I shot a look up at the still obscured sky, confused. I couldn't see the stars through the thick fog, so why was I able to see them reflected in the surface of the water? When I realized that I could only see the stars reflected off the port side of my boat, it only served to confuse me further. I finally realized what I was actually seeing when the reflected stars cut across my wake behind my boat. There, only visible in the water's reflection, was a massive man-of-war sailing ship moving across the water. The stars I thought I'd seen were oil lamps hung about the ship's 3 towering sails. There was nothing real in front of me, I was sure of that. No disturbed wake in the water, no shapes in the mist. But the reflection of the ship was as clear as my own. I stared at the man-of-war in silent alarm, listening to the still muffled shouts and chiming bell. The ship's motion continued to my starboard, retreating into the distance. Eventually, the reflected lights disappeared completely into the fog off to my left. The shouts and groans continued to echo from my right, however. "Hello?" I called out. The voices came to a sudden stop. Then they picked up again. A chorus of murmurs broke out, growing ever closer. Flashes of blue bioluminescent plankton came through the fog. Something was coming from that way. 30 feet away, the fog began to sway and agitate as if something were moving through it. Underneath the agitation, the blue flashes came faster and brighter. As the flashes approached, I saw their figures reflected in the hazy blue water. A group of ragged men were walking towards my boat with arms outstretched. I began rowing, pulling the water as if I was in a short sprinting competition, barely managing to pull away from the figures before they could reach me. My legs burned and my lungs struggled, but I kept up my pace for as long as I could. It was several minutes after the last sighting of the blue flash that I finally slowed my pace. For the next half hour, I kept my head on a swivel, searching around me for those telltale lights. I was so focused on them that exiting the fog came as a complete surprise. I watched the towering curtain disappear into the distance, still just trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Before I could make any decisions, a wave of exhaustion swept over me. I crawled into the cabin, laid down, and soon fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to the blessed sound of waves lapping against my boat. I climbed out into the sun and pulled out my GPS to see how far I'd managed to row during the ordeal. At first, I thought it must be broken. It said that I'd traveled almost 800 miles overnight. I turned it off, then turned it back on. It displayed the exact same location, just a few miles off the coast of Bermuda. I shot a look up at the horizon, dumbfounded to see the hazy outline of an island. I picked up the oars and began rowing again. I reached my planned port before noon, a full 10 days before I was supposed to. I stumbled on shore where Jake, one of my team members, helped me carry the boat to shore. I didn't have any answers for his awestruck questions. I didn't have them then, and I still don't have them now. All I can say is that I've canceled any further plans to head out to the open ocean alone.